You've entered Bookstorm. Your favorite authors are here to dive down deep into their best-selling books. Stay tuned to brave the storm.
Welcome back to BOOKSTORM Podcast. I'm your co-host, Kristen Civiletto. And listeners, you're tuning in from 105 countries and territories all over the world and all 50 states. And we know why. It's because we are bringing you the very best authors that are out there writing today. Today's no exception. We are so excited because we have New York Times and USA Today best-selling author Chanel Cleeton. Welcome, Chanel.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Well, we are very excited because we are talking about your newest novel, The Lost Story of Eva Fuentes, and I'm going to show this beautiful cover. This is one of those books. First of all, I had to match my nail polish to your cover
Oh,
because
I
I thought
love
it was
that.
so cool.
And that's one of my favorite colors, I have to tell you. So I love that. That's very cool.
But it is one of those covers that makes you want to read the book no matter what, because you can tell it's going to be rich and culturally interesting. And it is that and more. So we're going to dive into the book, of course, but I want to tell our listeners just a little bit about you and some of your background. They love to hear that. Now, you are originally from Florida, but you grew up on stories of your family as part of the exodus out of Cuba following the Cuban Revolution. Is that true? Like, was it from
Yes.
your grandparents?
So my father and my grandparents left Cuba in 1967 after the revolution. They were there, obviously, the revolution was in 59, and then they were there for a few years and then left on a freedom flight to the United States in 67.
Wow. And this is very interesting to me because sometimes families talk about their history and sometimes they don't. And you learn it maybe as an older
hmm
adult. Was this something that was a very much a part of your younger years, hearing these stories?
It really was. My grandparents lived with us growing up. And so they really kind of created a space where Cuban culture and history and music and food was just part of my daily life. We spoke Spanish at home. My grandparents primarily spoke Spanish. And so it was just a part of, something I grew up on. And then, as I got older, I think especially my background is in sort of my academic backgrounds in politics and international politics and history. And so I started to think more about kind of the stories I heard. It was very much sort of tailored to a younger person and a child. Obviously, I didn't hear kind of some of the more difficult things that they went through. And as I got older, I had more questions about that and wanted to kind of have a deeper understanding of the revolution and its aftermath and what their experiences were like.
Yeah. Yeah, you're very fortunate to be able to share in those stories. And it sounds like that may have instilled a passion for politics and history in you.
I think so. It wasn't something that I kind of was consciously aware of, but now that I look back at sort of the decisions I made and the academic trajectory I was on, I do think growing up in kind of an exile household and having, the stories of my family's experience coming to this country as refugees, I was very much, driven by kind of wanting to understand a little bit more of, why these events happen and kind of having an appreciation for the history and all of the events that sort of influenced these events. So,
Yeah. Well, I'm not surprised then that you pursued those interests academically. You went to the American International University in London. You have a master's degree in global politics from the London School of Economics and Political Science. And then you went on to get your Juris Doctor degree from South Carolina School of Law. And that is quite an incredible background, but it really adds incredible layers to your books and your writing. So I think your readers have benefited from that academic side of what you pursued.
well, thank you. No, it's definitely been very gratifying for me to kind of combine those passions, with the fiction that I write, and also to be able to incorporate my academic studies.
Yeah, yeah, very evident. Well, we're going to talk today about the lost story of Eva Fuentes, this beautiful cover, as I showed a minute ago. And before we get started with some questions, I want to talk a little bit about the background so our readers know, but without giving away any spoilers. You've got three stories that are intertwined throughout here. And one of the first characters that we meet is Margot Reynolds. She's an American expat in London in about 2024. And I was wondering if you could just very briefly tell us a little bit about her.
Absolutely. So, as we were kind of talking about my academic background, I obviously studied in London. And so I like to put, little things in my characters that I sort of relate to, or connections that I have with them. And so I was really drawn in this story to have the opportunity to have an American living in London as I did. And actually in university, I took an art history, museums and galleries course that talked about kind of issues of, questionable provenance and art seizures. And so I had that idea for Margot's character really from, those academic influences. She is kind of out of graduate school. She has her own business. She finds antiques and rare objects for clients, and she is hired to source this mysterious book. She learns that there's only one copy in existence, and it sort of sets her on this grand adventure where she has to both confront some things from her past and also find this missing book.
Yeah, and this proves a little dangerous.
It does, yes. If you've read my novels before, one of the things my readers will kind of know is I love to put an element of suspense in my books. And so you sort of get that in Margot's storyline as you find out who else is searching for the book and kind of the links that they will go to obtain it.
Yeah, when she's walking down London streets, I'm looking over my shoulder for her.
Yes.
So
No, and that was a fun detail to kind of put in the book because it really helped me to feel like I was remembering, my
yeah.
experiences walking down those streets and kind of able to walk in her shoes as she went through some of those scenes. So I put a lot of the neighborhoods like I kind of would frequent or places I lived when I
Yeah.
lived in London. So that was fun.
Yeah, that is. Now, another part of your story deals with Havana in 1966, and we meet Pilar Castillo. And she, if you want to tell us a little bit about her, she also has a very interesting story that develops throughout.
She does. So through Pilar's story, I really had the opportunity to kind of explore life in post-revolutionary Cuba. As I mentioned, my family
Mhm.
came over in '67, and so I'd sort of heard those stories. And Pilar's a librarian. Her husband has been taken by Fidel's regime and is being held somewhere she doesn't really know, what has happened to him. And so she's really going through a very transformative and difficult period, and she is tasked with protecting this book that her neighbor gives her, and really finds solace in the book, and she reads it and in the story and in the author's voice. And I've said before, this book is kind of my love letter to novels and to books and to the impact that they have on our lives. And so for Pilar, this book really is kind of a salvation at a time when she needs it the most. And then she becomes thrust in kind of a difficult situation as she's trying to protect the book and others, as a librarian that she's been entrusted with.
Yeah. I kept thinking to myself when I was reading her story parts about how far would you go to protect
Hmm.
these things that are important and meaningful. And I know we're going to get into that a little bit, but we do have one more character. And this is Eva Fuentes herself, our titular character. And we see her story playing out in Boston in 1900. And she was part of, traveling from Havana to Harvard to participate in like a cultural teacher exchange program. I was wondering if you could tell us a little more about her.
Yes, so Eva Fuentes is as kind of one of the main inspirations for the book came from her story and from the idea of this cultural exchange that happened. It was a real life event. It happened in 1900, and it was this large contingent of teachers in Havana who went to study for the summer at Harvard. And this was a really pivotal time in Cuban American relations because you just had the end of the Spanish American War. Cuba's fighting for its independence. The Spanish are gone, but they still haven't formally received their independence. And so Eva goes as a representative for her country. She's a teacher, and she's also filled with kind of this patriotic duty to represent Cuba well abroad. And then while she's there, she's working on a book, and it kind of leads her on an adventure. And the book that she writes during the summer school is kind of the thread that unites the three stories, and we follow it throughout over a century of time as it has different impacts on the lives of those who read it and who interact with it.
Yeah. Well, I want to follow up on that because it was a book that had a tremendous impact on these other women. And when Eva wrote the book, it was from a place of raw emotion, vulnerability. Do you think that's one of the reasons why it resonated with women after who read it?
I definitely think so. That's one of the things I think that books have such a powerful ability to unify us. And I think there is something so moving and feeling seen and feeling like you can find your experiences or your emotions reflected in a work. And so I really wanted to celebrate that and that ability that books have to connect us. And so because Eva is going through such a transformative time in her life when she writes the book, and I think she pours so much of herself into the book, I think that particularly heightens the reason why it resonates with Pilar so much when she finds it in 1966, as she herself is going through a very difficult time in her life when she's kind of questioning everything. They're both sort of having to reinvent themselves and the world around them as it's changing and as their personal lives are changing. And so that connection between them, I think, is as you said, very profound because of the circumstances in which they're both writing and also kind of absorbing the material.
And I was thinking too that both women would have also been feeling feelings of retribution. And so I was wondering if this was almost cathartic in some respects, especially for Eva.
I think very much so, yes. And
Mhm.
often I can only kind of speak for myself as an author, but I find writing my books to often be very cathartic. And so I sort of gave some of that passion for storytelling that I have and some of the same kind of relationship I have with my books to Eva when she was writing her book, which is the fictional book is called A Time for Forgetting.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, let me ask you this. We had talked a little bit about Pilar in 1960s Cuba, and of course, Fidel Castro and his regime that's created a place of fear and uncertainty, of political retribution. And I wanted to ask you about something that I noticed. We were able to observe through Pilar's eyes how people were still trying to survive and live. And some of them were turning to music, to the arts, and other ways to, I guess, cope with a very oppressive regime. So I wanted to ask you about that because it almost seems like books and art and music were necessary for people at this time. What do you think?
No, I think very much so. I mean, we often see art as a form of resistance. I think art is also a
Yeah.
form of endurance for people, and I kind of look at this on both like the higher macro level of looking at, the political world that's going on around them and the broader events that are obviously, very much outside of their control. But I think at the same time, if you kind of take it down to a more personal micro level, so many of us who can have, a passion for books can sort of relate to, even if it's, something as small as you just kind of had an off day. There's something magical about being able to open a book and
Yeah.
be transported and be able to escape, whatever it is that you're dealing with in that moment, and to kind of slip inside the characters' lives and inside this incredible world. And so I know for me, even just on a very personal kind of day-to-day level, books have had that effect on my life. But they also very much have the ability to do it when, you're going through something incredibly difficult. And so I wanted to sort of honor and highlight that.
Yeah, that was very evident, the solace that Pilar was able to get from the books that she had. It wasn't just one book, she had other books. They were important to her just generally.
Mhm.
But I also thought it was a very beautiful part of your story because there's some heavy duty things going on there, but
Yes.
we see people living their lives and trying to live them in a meaningful and rich way.
Well, and I think for Pilar in particular, she, as a librarian, she has sort of devoted her life to books, and
Yeah.
she talks about sort of the joy she gets interacting in the library with the patrons, and helping connect them with that book that she feels like is going to be a favorite or change their life. And so, there is a very hopeful note, I think, in her story, despite what she is going through and the environment in which she's living, and that she is able to find joy in these books and in knowing that they give other people joy as well.
Yeah. Well, there's your love letter part of your
Yes.
story. All right. There's a scene where a character says, and this is a quote, I like to think that things happen the way they're supposed to, even if it's hard for us to understand how or why. I'm glad the novel found you. Is this a sense of fatalism that was maybe bred by repression, or is this something else like hope?
I think it really is kind of a sense of hope. And I also think it is kind of a very Cuban sentiment of enduring amidst difficult times, finding kind of the ability to carry on. That's
Yeah.
something that I've been so awed by. And, obviously, we see this in other examples, but I think just personally, growing up and kind of hearing stories and seeing, you know, the way that people have handled adversity, that very much kind of moved me. And I wanted to celebrate that because I think it is important. It is easy actually to feel very overwhelmed by things. And I think there's something incredibly courageous about people who, are able to kind of carry on. And I've certainly seen that as I go through these books and I do research. I've seen that in kind of my personal life, but also in the historical record. You see these beautiful examples of, librarians who are living through a difficult situation, but are still finding that ability to connect with the public and to celebrate books and to spread that joy. And so I wanted to kind of honor that.
Yeah. And you see also maybe a sense of unity amongst
Yes.
the exiles, even. But, we don't necessarily have that in other societies where they don't collectively go through that kind of a struggle, where most people are living under a very repressed regime. And so it's interesting how it expresses itself in the way that, people relate to one another.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to go back to Margot just for a second because her character was really interesting to me. And I feel like maybe there's another book coming with Margot in it, which I'm going to ask you about in a second. But, as we talked about, she's an American living in London and she's finding antiques and lost items for clients. And sometimes there's things that she lost herself that she might be finding
Mm-hmm.
without giving away
Yes.
anything. Um, but I want to talk a little bit about stolen art because I almost got the sense here that it was something that robbed a people group of their identity. And I wanted to ask you about that whole notion because that is a big topic today.
Sure. No, and I think it's definitely nuanced in terms of every experience in history is slightly different when we talk about art seizure. Sometimes I think it's absolutely erasure, sometimes it's economic, sometimes it's a combination. Each kind of experience is a little bit unique. With the Cuban Revolution, I think there were different layers to it. Obviously, at the time, the term that Fidel kind of gave exiles who were leaving Cuba was he called them worms, which obviously is in itself a very dehumanizing term. And the idea that you were forced to leave with a suitcase, you couldn't carry kind of memories, things that maybe didn't necessarily have monetary value, but would have had sentimental value, like the kind of stripping away of all of those things, I think definitely has a very deep kind of psychological impact, obviously. But I think also, there was definitely, you saw the government seizing things that were valuable and, wanting to kind of hold onto that wealth and onto those possessions. So there's definitely different layers of it. But my first book that I wrote about kind of Cuba and historical fiction, Next Year in Havana, I talk a lot about that idea of, what you could take with you and what you left behind, because a lot of families were forced to kind of bury things in their backyards or in the
Yeah.
walls of their homes, or you would try to kind of pass them on. And that's one thing, with my family, we had very limited, amount of photographs. The things that we did were kind of smuggled out by others.
Wow.
Didn't have those sorts of things that, maybe don't have necessarily monetary value, but have sentimental value.
Right.
And that was definitely, I think, something that had an impact to kind of not, have that part that you can carry on with you.
Yeah. Yeah, that was very impactful in this book because, it just made you think about the things that we surround ourselves with that almost reaffirm our identity and help us connect when our memories start fading. Very interesting. Well, I know you're going to be basking in the glory of this book being released, but I was wondering if you could share with us maybe a clue about what's on your radar, what's next.
Oh, that's a great question. So I just finished sort of developmental edits, which is the round where my editor and I go back and forth a lot on, kind of the big substantive parts of the book. So I'm getting ready to start copy edits on my next release,
Wow.
but it will be out in the summer of 2026. That's kind of tentatively where we are. And I can't say too much about it yet. It's actually a pretty big departure for me. It's still historical, but it kind of is a new adventure. I'm really excited about it. New characters. It's 1960s, but there's kind of some twists and some fun things that I haven't done before. So I will hopefully be able to share more soon, and I should have, a cover and title and all of that. But it's one that I'm really excited to talk about more when I can. So it'll be summer 2026.
Very nice. Well, I hope you come back and talk about it on the
I
show.
would love that. Yes, thank you. No, that would be wonderful.
In the meanwhile, I want to tell our listeners how to find you. You have a very nice website, chanelcleeton.com, and they can connect with you there. And I just want to wish you all the best, though, with this story, the lost story of Eva Fuentes, because it is wonderful. It's entertaining. We've talked about a lot of deep topics, but at its core, it's also very entertaining and will keep you turning those pages. So I know our listeners and our readers are going to love it because we did. And we wish you all the best. Thank you for coming on.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you having me, and it was so lovely to speak with you. So thank you very much for having me on.
You as well.
Thanks.
All right, listeners, we have a fantastic lineup coming up for the early fall. We're so excited that you're tuning in, and we just ask that you continue to, share those links and share the word, because we are really growing every week. It's incredible. We've got Gareth Brown with the Society of Unknowable Objects, Mary Alice Monroe, Where the Rivers Merge, Daniel Silva, An Inside Job, Don Winslow, The Final Score, Lou Burney with Crooks, Joanne Harris with the prequel to Chocolat with Vienne, Christina Baker Klein and Ann Burt with Please Don't Lie, Laura Griffin, Innocence Road, Alma Katsu with Fiend. And again, you can find us on Instagram, on X, we're on BOOKSTORMPodcast.com, and we have a fantastic YouTube where you can see these authors and us. And we know why you're coming back again and again, because you can see the authors. They're live on the show on BOOKSTORM Podcast.